I'm standing here at Hidden Wetland at Mequon Nature Preserve, and right here this is phenomenal habitat for amphibians. Amphibians make up some of the creatures we see here in Wisconsin, usually in more mesic wet areas, so frogs, toads, salamanders, and there are newts in Wisconsin, but generally when we think about amphibians it's frogs. And here we have multiple species of frogs that will actually inhabit a wetland such as this. We have leopard frogs, green frogs, and bullfrogs are probably the three we'd see the most of. You can tell a lot by a frog just by its call. You don't even have to see it, because just like birds, they actually have different calls. So bullfrogs will actually have a real low call, whereas green frogs kind of almost it's like a grunt. So they all have different sounding calls. Why we care so much about amphibians at the preserve? Well, we are turning farmland back into habitat. So we're taking land that was made for humans and we are changing it back into land that is meant mainly for animals. And amphibians are very, very sensitive. So some animals are very tough and they're very hardy, and they can take an environment that has pollutants or not really the most optimal conditions. And then there are some that are really sensitive, and if anything goes wrong, they'll leave. And when we want to figure out if we are doing a good job building habitats, one of the species and one of the animals here that we like are amphibians. Because they are so sensitive, they tell us if we're doing a good job or not. So we actually have monitoring programs where we look out and we try to catch salamanders, because if we have salamanders, we know that we have really good land, because if we have any type of pollutants, we won't find them here. So that's probably the main reason why we really love to find amphibians out here. We're growing caterpillars this year, and we were talking about a complete metamorphosis, how it goes from an egg to a caterpillar to a chrysalis to a butterfly. So it goes through many steps and it changes a lot. Frogs do the same thing. So frogs start out as an egg, and then they work their way into a tadpole, and they'll spend lots of time swimming around in the pond, and they have gills like a fish, so they breathe underwater. They'll do that for a while, and as they grow, they'll actually have their legs will start to grow. They're basically like a head with a tail, and then their limbs start to grow, so they'll actually have arms and legs. And eventually they'll lose their tail, and they'll lose the gills that they breathe underwater with, and they will end up having lungs like we do, so they'll breathe air only. When they are tadpoles, they are mostly herbivores, meaning they eat plants, so they'll eat a lot of different algae and things in the ponds. But when they become adults, then they become strictly carnivores. You might have just heard one call that was a green frog. So when they're carnivores, then they're eating bugs, they're eating all the little invertebrates. They might even, if the bullfrogs, when they get big enough, a bullfrog will pretty much eat anything it can get in its mouth, so it'll even eat other frogs. So they become really big predators. And on ecosystems or ponds like the ones at MMP, bullfrogs are actually almost some of the top predators sometimes if there aren't any snapping turtles, because we don't really have generally any big fish in a lot of our ponds. These are ephemeral, meaning they dry up. So the amphibians actually are some of the top species, and predators are also really important. They're almost like, they can be a keystone species. So they're very important for everything below them. Here we have two different frog species right next to each other. They look a little similar, but we have a bullfrog and a green frog sharing our tank together. So the green frog is the one right here. So you can see going down that ridge, they've got that crest that goes right over their eardrum, the tympanium. Whereas with the bullfrog over here, you'll see it goes right around. So, oh, look at, there he goes. So the bullfrog will actually get bigger. They can actually get very, very big, because their diet is a little bit different than a lot of the other frogs and amphibians that we see here. Pretty much most amphibians are always feeding on crickets or any other type of insect, whereas bullfrogs are eating things, they can eat much larger things. They'll even eat fish, they'll eat mice, they'll even eat, there's been times where they've jumped at birds. So they'll pretty much eat anything that they can fit in their mouths, and since they get to be much bigger than the other amphibians here, that allows them to eat things that are a little bit bigger than bugs. Bullfrogs are important because they do act as predators, and the job of a predator is to keep other animal populations in check. They make sure that they don't just have, they're running wild and eating everything. The predators make sure that the prey species numbers are in control, which is actually good for them. And since bullfrogs eat a lot of different things in the ponds, they're almost considered a top predator. There are still other animals that will eat them too, though, so they actually, they perform two roles. They eat and they are eaten, so they are important both as predator and as prey. Bullfrogs love to live in wetlands and ponds, and ones that don't have a lot of big fish in them will help them a lot because, again, they can be eaten by other things when they are smaller, when they're tadpoles. When they're tadpoles, they can be eaten by things like green darn or dragonfly larvae. So actually a bug will be eating an amphibian. They're also food for fish. So bigger fish like bass love to eat frogs. So we're out here planting, and right next door to us, by a little pocket of water by Trinity Creek, we have a green frog here.
Green frogs are one of 7 frog species that we have here on the preserve. You can tell it's a green frog by its by its ridge.
Right here we have an American toad. You now know every toad species in Wisconsin. We only have one. It is the American toad, Buffo americanus. So they live in their habitat. They love to go around areas that still have a little bit of moisture. They like to go where there are leaves, lots and lots of dead leaves on the ground, because you'll see how they blend in with the earth. So they like to have lots of different ground cover, and they like areas where there is vegetation for them to hide in. They love to eat insects. They eat lots and lots of bugs. A lot of amphibians have crazy appetites, like frogs they love to eat, but man, do our toads really love to eat bugs. If given the opportunity, these toads probably eat about 1,000 insects a day. They have big appetites, and why they're important is because if you have a garden, you don't even need to spray any type of those bug chemicals, because if you have some toads in your garden, they will pretty much eat any bug that they can in there that would otherwise, might munch on your crops. So these critters are really, really good pest controllers. You may have heard that a toad can give you a wart. If you were to pick it up, you'd then get a wart on your hand. I'd just like to say that is a myth. That can't happen. A toad can definitely not give you a wart. If you ever were to pick one up, the worst thing that could probably happen is he might pee on you, but even then, that won't hurt you. Just go ahead and wash your hands. But yeah, I guess because toads have bumpy skin, they look like warts, and I guess people thought that they could then give you a wart. But nope, that's totally a myth. Frogs are pretty friendly to handle compared to a lot of critters out there. They're pretty harmless. So you see all the little things that are wiggling around in the pond here. These are tadpoles for American toads. So, oh, look at them all. And they're feeding on vegetation, but as they become adults and they grow their legs, they'll actually be a lot more mobile on land, and they'll actually become carnivores, meaning they're going to be eating pretty much lots of insects and other bugs. Not all amphibians look like frogs or toads. Some of them, you might actually have thought that they are lizards. So this one right here, this is called a salamander. So they too are an amphibian like frogs. Just like frogs, they actually grow up in the water. They don't have tadpoles, but what we do call them are larvae. So they look something like the adults, but they'll actually have gills behind their necks. They look almost like fans. And they use those gills to breathe underwater. When they become adults, they will actually lose those gills and develop lungs. And so they'll breathe air. Here at Mequon Nature Preserve, we actually really like having salamanders because they are a very good indicator of a healthy ecosystem. So our skin is a very good barrier against all types of infections and whatnot. So even though I have dirt on my hands, I'm not too worried about it. Maybe if I was going to eat something or if I had got a cut, I'd be worried about an infection. But other than that, I wouldn't worry because we have an excellent barrier for skin. Amphibians, they do not. Their skin absorbs pretty much anything that touches it. And so if there's any type of pollutants or toxins, anything that's really bad, that'll absorb into their skin and they have no say. So when we have these very sensitive species, that tells us that we don't have pollutants or toxins, that we have a very healthy place for them to live. So the one I'm holding in my hand, this is known as a tiger salamander. They are the largest terrestrial salamander that we have. Terrestrial meaning on land. So We actually have some salamanders that will spend all of their lives in the water, and they never come out on land. And those ones can be a little bit bigger. Those are known as mud puppies. But when it comes to the ones that crawl out on land, the tiger salamander takes the cake. So these guys will grow anywhere up to 13 inches, 14 inches. These guys can get really, really long. They are known as mole salamanders, and you'll see there's dirt all over my hands because they like to bury themselves a couple inches under the ground, so they'll stay there. And he's not the fastest, as you can see, so he's not trying to outrun predators. He's trying to hide from them. And then when it comes to what he eats, if it's different types of bugs or slugs or something, he's kind of like an ambush predator. So he waits for a bug to come by and then he snaps at it and eats it. So like that's kind of his method of eating, is he'll wait for something to walk in front of him. Since we're very interested in having these guys on our property at Mequon Nature Preserve, we like to try to find them, but we don't want to go and flip every log that they're hiding under because that would tear up the habitat. So Tilia, our restoration dog, actually knows what they smell like, and it's her job to sniff them out, and she can tell us exactly where they are so we don't have to dig around everywhere. So now on my left hand, this is not a baby salamander. As I had said, the salamanders grow up just like a frog would, so they'd actually have gills and whatnot. This is an adult. This is a different species. So these two are totally different types of salamanders, both native to Wisconsin. And you can see just how different they are. So the tiger salamander is much, much bigger, and it's got different colorations. So a lot of them will actually have either these spots, or they'll actually have stripes like a tiger. Whereas our blue spot here, this is as big as they get. They're much smaller, but you can see just how beautiful their blue coloration are. These are both cold tolerant, so that means even during the winter, they go down into the ground and they can handle that cold weather as long as they bury themselves and find shelter. Tilia can also sniff these out, so she knows what both of these smell like. So amphibians come in many shapes and sizes, not just your run-of-the-mill frog. There's lots of different types of amphibians in our state. And if you hike around, you might even actually get to find some. And if you do, as long as you're respectful, they'll be respectful back. They are very, very, look at them go. They're very, very fascinating creatures that we actually have here in Wisconsin.
Right here we have a gray tree frog, and they can also be green. So depending on the temperature or the habitat they are in, they can actually change their color. When they're on something like wood, like this one has been hanging out on a piece of wood, they're going to try to look more gray because that'll help them blend in more with the tree. But if they were surrounded by green leaves, they can also turn green. It's not instantaneous, it does take a little bit, but they can actually change their colors. So they're called gray tree frogs, but they can also be green. Being a tree frog, they're excellent climbers. So they produce a very sticky liquid that they have on their underside, and allows them to climb up a lot of vertical surfaces. I mean, they can climb up buildings, they'll climb up on glass. A lot of people will see them on windows or on their floodlights around their house, so they'll climb way up onto the lights. And I actually think they do that because, bugs are attracted to light, and so they'll actually climb up onto these lights, and when the bugs fly around them, then they get a free meal. That's why they're important, is because, as we always say, that a lot of amphibians are good controllers of insect populations. These guys can go where a lot of other frogs can't. So where a lot of frogs are in the ponds and whatnot, these guys are up in the trees and higher up, and they're eating other things. They'll eat caterpillars, they'll eat beetles, they'll eat lots of bugs that might not necessarily be found in the ponds that the other ones would eat.
Just like all the other amphibians we've talked about, they grow up underwater, and so they'll live in ponds and wetlands and probably areas of water that are, close to trees and, other habitats that the adults enjoy. But they do start out as tadpoles, and then they will develop their legs and their lungs, and then they actually become the adults that you see that will actually be climbing around on land.